the 6th annual Transport Symposium. We can hardly believe it. Transport stands for Translational Program of Health Disparities Research Training. We have Dr. Bhutan Foster to thank for that name, and we will thank her every year that we do this symposium. So Transport is an NIH-endowed program focused on recruiting and training underrepresented, minority, URM, junior faculty, postdoctoral candidates, and undergraduate students who come from Brooklyn and other communities that are vulnerable to health disparities. On behalf of the Transport Symposium Planning Committee, which includes Brooklyn Health Disparities Center, the School of Public Health, Leaders of Transport, Downstate CME Department, which includes Edeline Mitten, and our CBO panel members, whom you'll get to hear from today. We want to thank everyone, both in person and online, for attending today's symposium. So there's a little housekeeping. First of all, you will meet our transport scholars throughout the day. So we're not going to introduce them individually right now, but they will be presenting later on, and we thank them so much. We are so lucky. We have a great group. There will be 15-minute breaks at 10:15 and at 12 p.m. Our moderators will manage in-person audience questions at the end of each segment. For those of you on Zoom, please place your questions for our speakers and panelists in the chat, and more detailed bio information regarding our speakers and panelists is available in the program document, which is accessible using the QR code provided on the poster boards at our entrance, and I believe on our invitations online. Finally, poster presentations will be conducted during lunch, which begins at 1:25 in the area behind this conference room. And now, please welcome Dr. Marcus Lambert, Associate Professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, School of Public Health, Associate Vice President for Research, Strategy, and Operations, and one of our transport principal investigators to get us started.
Thank you so much, Dr. Straker. Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to our 6th annual Transport Symposium, Advancing the Science of Community-Engaged Research, Part 2. I'm delighted to be here today, and I want to express my gratitude to you all for taking the time to join us for this important event. I also want to extend my appreciation to the Planning Committee, all of those who've been able to help set this event up, our sponsors, and our partners for the symposium, including the Brooklyn Health Disparities Center and the National Institutes of Health and the Minority Health and Health Disparities Institute. Last year, we were able to gather here to discuss how we could advance the science of community engagement in the wake of COVID-19. Today, we come here together to continue this conversation and to explore new ways to address this persistent health disparities that plague our communities. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated these disparities, and it has underscored the urgent need for us to work together to find solutions. I currently have 4 kids between the ages of 13 and 8, I have twin boys, and I woke them up a little earlier this morning to prepare for this symposium so that I could be on time. On the way to school, I asked them, took the opportunity to ask them about health disparities. I said, do you know what health disparities are? And my oldest son, he said, well, disparities sound like despair, so I'm gonna guess it's something sad. And I said, you're not too far off. But disparities, I told him, refers to differences. And it's not just, differences that we're born with, but differences that often can be prevented. And, I grew up in predominantly black neighborhoods in Cincinnati, Ohio, and in Atlanta, Georgia. I went to college in Washington, D.C. And, sort of reflecting back on all of these sort of neighborhoods, there were a couple common things that you might find, but two things that really always stood out to me no matter where I went in the country. I could always find, especially in these black neighborhoods, a dollar store, which I loved shopping at, growing up, because I could get all these things for like just $1, even though these things have now increased at dollar stores. But I would also always find fast food restaurants. And growing up, we ate maybe fast food occasionally, a couple times a week, but that was what was accessible to us. And the data actually shows that this is quite common. If you look at, there was a town in West Oakland, a neighborhood of about 30,000 people. They have one supermarket, 36 liquor and convenience stores, and a fast food restaurant on almost every corner. And it was my daughter, I was telling her about these stats, and she said, "Wait a minute, Dad." It's always that one kid who's going to call you out. She said, "Here in Brooklyn, we don't have that many fast food restaurants. There's some nice restaurants that we have here in Brooklyn too, especially in central Brooklyn, And I said, "You're right." When I actually moved to Brooklyn, over 15 years ago, I had said things were a bit different here. You don't find as many fast food places. I saw the dollar stores, which made me happy, but especially as a graduate student, but you don't find as many of the fast food restaurants. And you find a lot of diversity here. So I actually went back to the literature on this. Typically, the density of fast food restaurants are higher in black neighborhoods. A 2004 study conducted in New Orleans looked at the relationship between fast food density, so the number of restaurants per square mile in shopping areas, and they compared that to percentage of black residents. They also looked at the effect of neighborhood income. And the percentage of black residents was associated with fast food density. And black neighborhoods had 6 times as much fast food as you found in white neighborhoods. And income was also correlated in that particular study. But in another study, and income was not necessarily the driving factor. A study in Atlanta showed that low and high income, predominantly black areas, had less access to restaurants that were not fast food than comparable white areas. And there have been several studies to show that fast food chains, they actually market to black and poor children more than other groups. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. So that sounds familiar, right? But in New York City, a study showed that across the 5 boroughs, especially fast food restaurants were not necessarily as prevalent in these boroughs. They were predominantly in commercial areas, such as the shopping districts, tourist areas, think Times Square, Port Authority, Penn Station, Wall Street. It really wasn't until you got sort of in the residential neighborhoods, mostly outside of the boroughs, that the fast food becomes more prevalent in the black and Latino neighborhoods. So New York City, Brooklyn is different. So across our communities, many families are struggling with access to things like healthy foods, which we know can be a driver of some of our disparities in health. But just as sometimes our general run-of-the-mill approach to health disparities may apply across the country when it comes to these sort of fast food relationships with black density, it doesn't necessarily apply here. So we have different sort of characteristics which require specific training, which require people from this community to inform us about the culture, about the neighborhoods, about our lifestyle, about the things that are valuable to us here in central Brooklyn, in New York City, in our 5 boroughs. And that's what we're about. We're not just sort of a typical health disparities center. We're not just training the typical people. We're training unique people who are addressing unique situations that will also be informative and generalizable across the country. So this is a really unique opportunity to think about how we engage the community on these efforts. And I told my kids, I said, how do we fix this problem of health disparities? And they said, well, maybe providing some more healthier food. They said, well, on the hamburgers, there are vegetables, there are lettuce, there's tomatoes, And I said, well, yeah, those are actually pretty good ideas. I said, maybe, how many of you like smoothies? Maybe we can incorporate a carrot in the smoothie. You may not taste it so much, right? But, I thought about this in relationship to the community. I have to ask my kids what they like to eat and what their opinion is and engage them on how to help improve healthy eating. And it's the same for our communities. We have to engage our communities on how to improve health disparities within our communities. So that's what this day is about. It's about thinking about the science of community engagement and how we really incorporate our community into the research that we do. So I'm really excited for the rest of the activities, our speakers, our panels, our poster sessions, our oral presentations. It's a lot to look forward to this morning. And I'm going to save our time and really turn it over to our president, who unfortunately could not be here today. I think he's actually celebrating his anniversary. But he was so kind to record a video for us. So next we have our president, Dr. Wayne Riley, to open us with welcoming remarks. Thanks.
Good morning, I'm Dr. Wayne Riley. It's my pleasure to welcome you as president of SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University to this 2023 Transport Symposium, Advancing the Science of Community Engaged Research. Our research community is intensely focused on broadening our research skills, capacity, acumen, and sensitivity in our community to advance science to address healthcare disparities. This symposium hopefully will provide wonderful opportunities for discussion and engagement among colleagues from all over the country who are equally interested in advancing community-engaged research. So I hope you have a wonderful symposium, interact with your colleagues, and take the skills that you acquire here at this conference and to go back out to your home institutions and do great work. Also want to welcome Dr. Abbasi from my former hometown of Houston, Texas, where I began my medical career in the Texas Medical Center, and the great colleagues at the University of Houston where he works for his presence at our symposium. Thank you very much and have a great meeting.
Thank you. Next we have a welcome from Kim Council. She's the recently appointed Deputy Borough President, Borough Brooklyn President, and it's a virtual presentation from her as well.
Hello, SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University. I am Deputy Borough President, Reverend Kimberly Council, and it is an honor to join the 6th Annual Transport Symposium. This event's foundation is one that aligns perfectly with the tenet that Borough President Antonio Reynoso and I consider extremely important in our approach to leadership: community engagement. One cannot try to solve for a problem without understanding it, but more importantly, how it intricately impacts a group of people and their perception of the problem, and then keeping them engaged through a solution. It's what I like to call working for the people, with the people. This is the purpose of the Transport Symposium, bringing in such a diverse group of stakeholders from our community to discuss the challenges associated with the social determinants of health in our central Brooklyn community faces every day, and how we can take those lessons to create a healthier, more informed community. From healthcare providers to medical residents and student nurses, scientists, community groups, and residents, I can't wait to listen to the rich discussion had today and see how they're turned into actionable frameworks and strategies to strengthen our communities. Thank you again for having me, SUNY Downstate.
Next, I would like to welcome for some remarks Alicia Goodrich, the Assistant Vice President for Government and Constituent Relations here at SUNY Downstate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. That side was good. This side was a little light. Come on, Francesca. Good morning. Yes. And I'm so happy to see all my colleagues and community people, friends and neighbors. This makes, I'm happy to be back in person. I've been here about a year and a half. I was told by the leadership team that I'm no longer a freshman, but I will still be a freshman for about 5 years, right, Dr. Christine? Give me grace. But I want to welcome everyone to the 6th Annual Transport Symposium, and from the new Deputy Borough President and the Borough President, they're excited about what we're doing, and you know what the borough president's work is in maternal health. So we have a lot of work to do, and that's my responsibility, government and community relations. And I always say I'm more community than government, and I know that's recorded, so I'm gonna be in trouble, but it's the truth. I come from the community, and I'm excited because I walked in with a young woman that came in, and I know she heard about it through the community because I shared this invite everywhere. And if we do one step at a time, that's the growth that we need. Because we, as I always say, we're a diamond that got covered back with coal, and now we have to break the pieces off to show the star that we are, the rare form that we are, research, hospital, everything. We are the other medium of the spectrum. It's the hospital and the church. They come to both for help. So, tackling and eliminating health disparities is a key priority to my office, and more importantly, our patients and the community at large. My first love of research, coming from the library sciences background, is not complete without the input of the people. And the people who are affected by these issues daily, that sometimes are not even aware that they're being treated at a disadvantage. So for us, it's important for us to tackle the underlying systemic inequities while bringing them up to the level that they deserve and need to be across the globe. During the 2022, Symposium, one of the most important notes from the community engagement section of Dr. Perez Stable's talking points was about the fact that scientists need to be in the community. They need to roll up their sleeves, and they need to be shoulder to shoulder with people, because that's the only way you're gonna get the true information. If we are behind these doors at our computers, you're not gonna get the real of what is going on in our community. If we go outside right now and did a survey, you would be amazed at the responses and information that you will collect from the average daily person walking by, taking their family member to the ER or to our clinics. So we need to remove the Band-Aid of care and heal the wound properly of tackling health disparities one stitch at a time. Yeah, that's deep, right? Yeah, well, that felt good. I was on the way here in my Uber. I said, this is good, because we have used a Band-Aid for as long as we know. And that Band-Aid cannot hold up what is really going on under, which is the wound that it cannot heal until we get the proper collaborative efforts. So that's community, that's the researchers, the experts, the doctors, all coming together, and we have the space to do it. So we have to use this space. We should have a symposium every week. Sorry, I don't want to make you crazy, Dr. Salafu, but it's important that we have continuous conversations. So my office, along with strategic planning, BHDC, and others, we are coming together to do health conversations in the community. So we'll be reaching out to all the chairs for you to come out, get your special people out to speak to the community, and let them see the faces that are doing the work behind these doors. So I want to thank you all for your contributions and what the transport program has been doing and will continue to do, and I look forward to the partnership. And I want to say a special thank you to Dr. Salafu, Dr. Carla Booten-Forster, and Dr. Straker, who are my new mentors in this work, and I'm excited for what we are about to do. Thank you so much for your time, and let's get sharing the information. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I next want to sort of introduce and highlight our principal investigators of transport. You know, I'm really fortunate to be a part of an excellent leadership team that really includes Dr. Straker and Lakia Maxwell as well. And our principal investigators, Dr. Mauro Salafu, who's the professor and chairman of the Department of Medicine and director of the Brooklyn Health Disparities Center, Dr. Carla Booten-Forster, associate dean of the Office of Diversity, Education, and Research, professor of clinical medicine in the Department of Medicine, myself, and Dr. Riley. And we all complement each other in many different ways. So it's really been excellent sort of working with the four of them. So you'll hear from them at different parts of this symposium. We've sort of divided it up, you know, sort of equitably so that you see many of us in many different ways. But next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Moro Salafu to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Thank you, Dr. Salafu.
Very nice. Good morning to all of you. Good morning. Very nice. I think a lot has been said. I like what Marcus said in the introductions. You just basically summarized everything, so I don't have to say too much. But I want to tell you a little bit about BHDC, the Brooklyn Health Disparity Center. It was set up in 2004, and the model was 3 parts: academic, community, and government. And the principle was that you couldn't find solutions if you didn't have these 3 elements working together. You need the academic environment to do the research and find the answers to the questions. You need the community to actually, implement those solutions, and you need government to connect everybody. So the BHDC model is the SUNY Downstate, the Arthur Ashe Institute for Urban Health as the community partner, and then the Brooklyn Borough President's Office. That is how BHDC was formed. And it's very effective, and you can see what is going on today. But the issue is that we spend a lot of time trying to find why. We never really found the time to say community, community, community. And that is why this symposium is so important. Now we want to highlight the community aspects of what we do and try to connect the community to what we do. And also listen to the community input into what we do. Could we have the slides for Dr. Obasi up? Okay, so before I introduce Dr. Obasi, I would like to acknowledge our Senior Vice President for Research, Dr. David Christini. Thank you for coming. I also want to acknowledge the Dean of the College of Medicine, Dr. Charles Brunukadi, who's not here today, but very supportive of the symposium and the transport activities. And then the Dean of the School of Public Health, who's not here today, but very, very supportive of the program. All right, so let's now get to Dr. Obasi, Ezeminari Obasi. He's going to be speaking on the advancing the science of community-engaged research, health equity empowerment. He's going to give his experience working as a health researcher for a very long time and the success that they've been able to achieve in their institution that will give us examples of what to do in what we do in Brooklyn. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree in physics at the University of California, Irvine. He then went on to earn a PhD in psychology at the Ohio State University, while also obtaining a minor in quantitative psychology and psychometrics and data analysis. So he's really a complete scientist in that regard. He completed his pre-doctoral internship at Harvard Medical School, McLean Hospital. He's a Hugh, Roy, and Lily Kranz Cullen Distinguished University Chair and serves as the Associate Vice President for Research Administration at the University of Houston. So he has a huge administrative responsibility in the university as well. His research focuses on the intersection of the neurobiology of stress, addictions, health disparities, and cultural predictors of health behaviors. To this end, Dr. Obasi has led or participated in over $30 million in NIH funding to the institution. So he's a very busy, proliferative investigator who has served the community so well. For those of you who know the mechanisms of the NIH, he's received RO1s, RO3s, P20s, P30s, a lot of U54s, and he's currently the director of the RCMI. RCMI stands for Research Centers in Minority Institutions. RCMI is like the top. When you receive an RCMI award into an institution, it means you've really reached the pinnacle of health disparities research, and he's been able to attain that at the University of Houston. He's also director of the Health Center for Addiction Research and Cancer Prevention, very similar to what we have BHDC. His center is called the Center for Addictions Research and Cancer Prevention. And he's also the founder and director of the University of Houston's Health Research Institute. He's actively involved in the community while disseminating cutting-edge research designed to improve their quality and length of life. So we are really, really, really privileged to have Dr. Obasi come to us to share his experience. So please join me in thanking and welcoming him to Downstate.
Thank you so much for such a nice introduction. Makes me seem like I have too much on my plate. But I'm really excited to be here, happy to have the invitation, and we'll try to provide some context around the work that I do at the University of Houston. There's an awful lot of slides, so I will be going as quickly as I can to get through the content, and hopefully it'll spark some good Q&A for us to engage after the presentation. But I do want to disclose that I'm a founder and CEO of Health Equity Empowerment, and a lot of the work that I'll be presenting today will be a function of some of the NIH funding that I have to do the work that we're doing in Houston. I know oftentimes we talk about health disparities and it seems like it's something that just began. And these are things that have been in existence for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I want to provide some historical context to be able to shape, what the challenge truly is and why it's so hard for us to break through. Also want to give some just brief introduction about community engaged science, what that can look like. Provide some examples of how I've applied that to some of the work that I'm doing in Houston. And then talk about the need for us to think about prevention and to do our science a little bit differently. So when I think about the challenge, I think of the work of Marimba Ani, who is native in this area. And she, in her writings, used the word maafa, which is a Kiswahili term for the great disaster. And essentially what that does is sort of put into context the whole experience that people of African descent has gone through from the transatlantic slave trade through their experience in Americas. And I think if we can sort of start our conversation in that space, you can kind of get a sense of where things began to break down and how systems were put into place to maintain a certain way of life for certain communities. And so I think about one of my trips to Ghana, West Africa, and was in Elmina, which is often, there's a big sign that calls it the Elmina Castle. It's a castle to some people, it's a dungeon to others. And I think it's important to think about the role that played in shaping our experience. This is a room that's on the top floor in Elmina. And in this room, anyone who put up any resistance was placed into this room. And this door did not open back up until everyone in that room had died of starvation. At the center of Elmina, you have a church. You have all the women who stayed above grounds. All the men were separated below ground. The men could just hear their mothers, daughters, sisters, aunts being raped, brutally punished, and couldn't do anything about it. Meanwhile, you have the president, or Shantahini, whatever language you want to use, stowed away in this top room here while they hear people praying and so forth. Ultimately, people were funneled through what they would call the door of no return, which fortunately many of us have been able to return. But it's important to understand how family structures, how abuse and all these things were baked into the very beginnings of our transition into this new world. We know that over 15 million people were brought through this slave trade, and we know that over 40% of them didn't make it. For many people, especially within their spiritual systems, took the position that it might be best to just start all over again and try the next life. So it wasn't uncommon for people to take their lives and not go through with what was awaiting them. The experience was just so brutal that they couldn't comprehend what that world would look like if this is what it began, how it began. Fast forward this to the US, we have lynchings that have taken place. In this particular image, it's Thomas Shipp and Abraham Smith in Indiana, falsely accused of a crime, snatched out of jail, dragged, beaten, and hung in front of over 20,000 people. In this instance, you have Will Brown in Nebraska, same experience, taken from jail, burned, beaten, dragged, and in this instance, Even pieces of the rope were sold as a souvenir. We have a more modern time experience of James Byrd. This is in Texas. Many of you heard of him being dragged by the back of a truck until his head and arm was severed. We have the experience also in Texas of Sandra Bland, where she was pulled over by a routine traffic stop and then unexpectedly was found dead in police custody. The narrative was that it was suicide. People in the community would beg to differ. You have in another neighborhood in Texas, I happen to be from Texas, and it's just all these things are just everywhere. This is more recent in 2018, I believe, where you had a pool party where neighbors didn't believe that these women belonged in the neighborhood, called the police on them. They were just having a birthday pool party. And you can see them being manhandled as if they were the most dangerous things on earth. We're all familiar with the George Floyd case, also ironically connected to Texas. He did his education in Third Ward, which is right by the University of Houston. So this hit a lot of people in very real ways. But at the end of the day, being Black in America sometimes can be challenging. And you have to have these conversations with your kids around how to defend yourself, how to survive the incident, how to keep your mouth shut, all those things. And what does that do to you from a health standpoint? Sometimes we lean on our spirituality, but we know in this instance, people went to Bible study and were gunned down. So sometimes even our places of worship isn't even safe. We know about poverty. We know about how oftentimes this is intergenerational poverty, how hard it is to lift ourselves up out of these conditions. But oftentimes we don't know what the effects of poverty has on our day-to-day lives. In a lot of our research, we talk about socioeconomic status as being a big key in understanding health outcomes. We talk about racism as being a key factor, but we don't really talk about how. What are the mechanisms? How is this stuff really affecting our health in meaningful ways? And those are some of the things I would like to uncover. And ultimately, we often talk about education as a platform to sort of uplifting ourselves and sort of to pursue new ventures. But we also aren't having the conversation about how our future intelligence is being killed in the educational systems. I think about my son, who is in a very privileged environment with two parents with PhDs. He's in advanced placement everything, all A's and 1 B+, and was recently in school suspension, trying to defend himself against a white student that called him racial slurs. So even if you're at the top of your class, you still are subjugated to an experience that make you not even want to go to school anymore. And so these are some of the struggles that I think kind of help shape how difficult the challenges are that we're trying to address. When we think about health disparities, it's bigger than just any one factor. The CDC came up with an indicator called years of potential life lost. And what that means is that if we look at all people diagnosed at the same time, given access to the same care, who is surviving and who isn't surviving, and what is the cost of that? And so when we look at this across various racial ethnic groups, it is very clear that African Americans lead in years of potential life lost. If we begin to break this down by various conditions, whether it's heart disease, whether it's cancers, whether it's diabetes, whether it's HIV, whether it's homicide, years of potential life loss is really killing the Black and Latinx communities. Whether we talk about income, look at Black and Latinx folks at the bottom of the income. Look at poverty, same indicators. Look at unemployment, same trends. Look at access to medical care, whether we're living in medical deserts, thinking about how affordable access to care actually is. In Houston, we have a huge underserved population, in part because they can't afford it. They can't get to it, it's not accessible. The health literacy isn't there. The materials aren't speaking to their experience, sometimes not even in their preferred language. And no one wants to talk about preventive care. Oftentimes we just end up in the ER because we just didn't have the resources to address it or didn't even have the knowledge to know of what to do. And so in order to think about health disparities and to think about potential solutions, we have to take a holistic, systemic approach to addressing it. And that's where I think having this conversation around community-oriented research is extremely critical. Because what we know is that very little of our science actually translates into interventions that affect people's lives. And when it does, there's a 15 to 17-year lag between scientific breakthroughs and the patient benefit. That's just truly unacceptable. And part of why that could be the case is that we're doing research on communities that we want to impact without them being part of the conversation. If we were addressing issues that the community said, these are the issues we want solutions to, maybe there'd be a little bit more energy to want to collaborate. Maybe there'd be a little bit more energy to want to put the interventions into place in order to improve the social conditions that they're experiencing. And so obviously we have various strategies for going about this. Community-based participatory research is a strategy that's often sort of discussed. Sort of in this space, we're looking at collaborative partnerships between the university and the communities that we're trying to make an impact on. But this question of equality becomes very difficult to manage. Do you have that sort of humility to say, despite all my accomplishments, all my publications, all my grants, and all my notoriety, that I'm going to sit at the same table as someone that maybe just has a GED, but that we both have equal voice and equal say into what's going to happen, from the development of research questions all the way to the execution of the projects, all the way to the dissemination of the findings back into the community. All aspects of the research process. This takes a lot of patience, takes a lot of training on both sides. Everybody wants to jump to the solutions, but it's not always that simple, right? We need to think about the community as its own unique identity. You know, where I'm at, 3rd Ward and 5th Ward, you know, East End, all super neighborhoods have their own unique conditions, own unique challenges. You can't go into one place and assume that what worked there will work in another place. We need to think about how we even acknowledge what the community brings to the table. What strengths are already in existence? What programming is already in existence? How do we bring some of our resources to amplify what's already working but just under-resourced? So ultimately, we want to think about that balance between how do we advance the science, you know, but also how do we affect the community in meaningful ways. And so oftentimes I have very long conversations with faculty around what are the products that we're looking for? How do we get beyond just the publications and presentations and more grant applications? How do we get the information back into the spaces that really need the knowledge that has been generated? How do we think about the relevance of community-identified problems? You know, I think one of the most impactful grants that I ever got was in an area that wasn't even my area. Community said we're suffering from type 2 diabetes and obesity. I know nothing about that, but I can write grant applications. Got $2 million from United Health Foundation to provide prevention work, and oh my goodness, the testimonials of people feeling like they have a reason to live again was mind-blowing. Sometimes we have to step outside of our comfort zone and sort of leverage our strengths to meet them where they're at versus, hey, I'm in addictions research. Can we focus on that? Well, we need mental health. We need obesity. We need diabetes. If you're willing to do that, we're willing to have a conversation. So there has to be a bend in that space. The other piece that is critical is disseminating the knowledge gained to all the partners. As academics and as institutions, we believe we own everything. I don't know if I want to share this with you. You might steal it. You might take it. You might do this, that, and the other. How do we figure out ways of making sure that all this information is transparently available to all who can benefit from it, including other places that could do a similar intervention in a different location? We're just so afraid of our ideas being stolen for good reason that sometimes we're reinventing the wheel 1,000 different ways and slowing down our progress to make a collective impact across the nation. I think the other piece is thinking about ways in which we could increase the capacity of the community to do the work that it's doing. NIMHD is very clear in these new U54s, RCMIs, around how is the funding that we're giving the University of Houston directly helping the community in meaningful ways? How are we using these resources to foster current programming that the community would want to see happen, whether you had an interest in it or not? And so now we get into these very crazy spaces around what's allowable from a grant standpoint and what the community needs and what the funder is saying to do, even though there's compliance challenges in doing it in certain ways. But those are things that we need to work through. How do we put together programs that are sustainable across time? Far too many times we have that sort of helicopter approach. We have our new grant, we come in for a few years, the grant runs out, we're done. The community is like, oh, the problem isn't going away. This is why we don't want to collaborate with you, because you come in and then you leave and then we got to start all over with another person and we already spent all this time working with you. I'm done. And then ultimately, how do we translate these findings in a rapid way? And that's where I'm going to sort of end on, sort of in that space of how we're doing it at the University of Houston. But while CBPR is oftentimes viewed as one of those gold standards of doing this work, it's very difficult to do it in a very pure way. And so what we have is a lot of folks who do more community-engaged research, where you sort of have very similar values of community-based participatory research, but instead, it's not everything is done, the community doesn't have an impact on all aspects of the research. And so oftentimes you're relying on things like advisory boards, advice of how to collect the data, folks helping with recruitment and retention, but you're the one driving the questions, the methodology, and surveys, and things of that nature. The products are owned by the institution versus it being a joint ownership, but it's still disseminated to all the stakeholders. And then the research is taking place in the community, but the community members aren't always active participants in that process. So for me, when I think about this work, it often comes some questions of how is the community being operationalized? And I think we need to be very specific about what we mean when we say community, whether it's location, whether it's values, culture, and so forth. Who are the people in the community that are best to partner with? I can't tell you how many times you see the same faces in all the meetings, and then you go to the door and folks have never even heard of these individuals. And so somehow they become the person to go to, but they're not really a speaker of the folks that they represent. What does joint ownership of the project look like? Who are the deciders? Is there equity in who decides? And how do you sort of sustain that partnership across time? For us, we think about it, systemically. We understand that some issues will take decades to solve, even if the president believes we can go in and do this in 1 or 2 years. We're realistic about this. And we think about ways in which we can leverage university resources in order to have some of these projects be sustainable. A quick example of that, I told you a little bit about obesity and type 2 diabetes. Another challenge was mental health. And so the University of Houston created a new medical school. They were creating a new space on campus to provide services. They needed a training hospital, all those things. And I advocated very strongly to do it using a model that would sort of mirror FQHC, so that the med school will have the space to do its work, but the community will have access to free mental health, physical health services on the campus. And so we were able to leverage the building of the medical school to have an infrastructure on campus to address unmet needs of our Black and Latinx communities, which shows one way of sustaining this growth across time. So when I think about some of the work that I do, I think it's hard because you have a sense of what the issues are. But unless you do the research a certain way, get the certain data to look a certain way, folks won't necessarily believe you. And even if it's convincing, they still won't believe you. And so I start off with this quote from Frantz Fanon, which says, "Sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. when they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect that core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with that core belief. Some of the things that are often thought of within the African American community is that we are extremely high users of substances. But when you look at the data, all the things that should be protective just isn't working for us. We are late initiators. That's one of the best protective factors to have in addictions. We don't start early. We're in that household, that stuff just isn't tolerated. But when you leave early adulthood, 18 to 25, you start to see this huge shift in utilization patterns. At a point in time when the stakes are much higher. You now have a family, you have a job, what is at stake is much greater. And so I begin to wonder, how can we have such low utilization rates, but at the same time lead the country in all the negative consequences associated with use, right? And so in this space, I begin to wonder about all that historical stuff. Maybe there's just a chronic stress issue that we haven't fully understood. And so begin to look at chronic stress, genetic markers, stress dysregulation as a potential model to predict drug use vulnerability. And ultimately that feeding back into the stress dysregulation, breaking down our systems, and ultimately leading to health disparities. So this is the specific work that I do. So in this space, just to share some quick outcomes, we have found that just based on your genetic makeup, people produce different amount of cortisol throughout the day. This has taken nothing else into consideration. So there is a biological factor that is important in the African American community. Within this space, we looked at the cortisol awakening response. And essentially, when you wake up in the morning, your body injects a bunch of cortisol that kind of gets you activated to go about whatever your daily challenges are. That's sort of what gets us up. And so you would expect about 30 minutes after wake up to get that sort of peak and for it to come back down throughout the day, pretty much non-existent, so that you can go to sleep. If it doesn't go down at the end of the day, oftentimes you wake up and might get sick across time because the body just isn't resting how it's supposed to. So this pattern is extremely important. When we looked at African Americans 18 to 25, who were low in stress and low alcohol consumption, had a very robust cortisol awakening response. For those who were high alcohol consumers but still low stress users, you can see that this response has gotten a little bit more blunted. For those who were high stress, low alcohol users, even more blunted. And for those that were high stress and high alcohol users, 18 to 25 years of age, don't even have a cortisol awakening response anymore. I don't know if this can be turned back on. These are things that we're trying to study right now. But we're already seeing a dysregulation early on in their adulthood. Other factors that have come into play is just access to basic family resources to sort of meet your basic needs. We have found that when we put the same group into acute stress situations, so it's a laboratory experiment, put them through a stressor, take saliva samples, see how these biomarkers are shifting across time. We have found that folks with low family resources, regardless of their stress and experiences, have a much more blunted reactivity to acute stress. Again, evidence of the chronicity of chronic stress across time, really shifting how the biology affects its capacity to meet stressors in efficient and effective ways. Even if we look at where you live, we have found that chronic stress is strongly related to family resources. The more resources you have, the less stress you experience, and vice versa. We know that neighborhood violence is correlated with chronic stress. We know that crime is associated with chronic stress. We know that drinking is associated with chronic stress. When we look at various trajectories, this is what sort of that cortisol trajectory throughout the day is supposed to look like. Only about 30% of our sample was in that space. Most folks were in a hypoactive, but I want to talk about this hyperactive space. These are folks that when they wake up, they're having high amounts of cortisol, but it's not coming down. And so they're sort of in that transitional space of always being triggered one way or the other. And then ultimately, we have this third group, which we believe is what the long-term outcome would be if this isn't resolved quickly. We have over 60% of our sample in a hypoactive, which means the system isn't even reacting to stressors like it was once designed to. And so that's where people can engage in other substances to kind of help get through these acute situations, which is why our model sort of feeds into that stress dysregulation, into substance use, into sort of chronic diseases that happen downstream. So that's, various biomarkers. I took this a step further and looked at just neuronal activity, because many people would argue a neuron is a neuron, doesn't matter what your race or ethnicity is, they all operate the same way, right? So if we did a study looking at neuroimaging, we shouldn't see any real group differences. So in this design, sort of basically used a basic serial subtraction test, which is often used in stress paradigms, and then also looked at sort of alcohol versus non-alcoholic cravings and so forth, with the idea of seeing, are there ways in which African Americans' brains are reacting to this stimuli in ways that are different from their European American counterparts? So this is sort of what they would see in a scanner. They would use their hand to sort of respond accordingly. So when we looked at alcoholic beverages, we took all the ways in which the brain was activated when it saw alcoholic beverages, and then subtracted the same spaces that were lit up by their European American counterparts. And this is what unique activation experiences that African Americans had. And so folks said, well, do it in the reverse. Let's look at the European American activation, subtract out the African American activation, and see how much unique activation is happening in that space. This is what we got. Same pattern for unique stress existed, where you see a hyperreactivity to alcoholic stimuli, a hyperreactivity to stress stimuli. So when we think about all this work, the question is, how do we break through? And there are a lot of challenges that we have to break through. We all know about the Tuskegee syphilis study. We all know about issues of racism and discrimination. In fact, when you go in the community and have these conversations, they don't have to go back to the Tuskegee time frame. They could talk about their experiences at the doctor last month. Folks just don't want to engage the medical space. Tired of being talked down to, tired of not being heard, tired of not getting information in ways that make sense to them, tired of getting medication that's outdated, tired of seeing people that don't look like them. So whether it's diversifying the pipeline, whether it's questions of cultural incompetence, whether it's questions of diagnostic bias, whether it's question of data prescriptions, all these are challenges that folks don't want to sort of engage both the medical professions and institutions to do this work together. One from my specific field that I found to be fascinating is this idea of drapetomania. Anyone ever heard of that term before? So drapetomania was a term that is translated into flight from home madness. And so anybody who was enslaved in the US that decided that it was worth the risk to flee and try to save anything about their culture as possible was deemed psychologically crazy. Because why would you not want to be enslaved on this plantation, right? So to do this work, you have to have an infrastructure, right? And what was presented earlier in my introduction was we received a pretty sizable infrastructure grant. That helps an awful lot to do the work in the community. It is very difficult for a single investigator as an individual to both establish relationships, get the work done, publish, and do all those things and stay on track from a promotion and tenure standpoint. It's much easier when you have these relationships already built out, where they can just plug into a system and get their work going. This is what has happened for us. One of the mechanisms that we have in this space is called a Community Research Advisory Board. And sort of in this space is where we train community members to be community scientists. And in that space, we also recognize that they bring unique talents and experiences that are equivalent to our educational experiences. We believe it's important to include them in all aspects of the research process, in part because we also understand the limitations of our training, that none of our disciplines are designed to eradicate health disparities in isolation. It truly has to be across disciplines with community engagement involved. These CRAB members make sure all of our research questions are culturally appropriate, all the measures that are used make actual sense, that the things that we are actually studying are relevant to the community, that the community even cares about these various constructs being studied. Problem solve any issues or potential barriers that could affect people's willingness to participate in the research. Sometimes your flyer alone will tell people stay away. And how do we sort of address problems before they even become a problem? They also help optimize recruitment strategies. In Houston, we have the Texas Medical Center. There's an awful lot of institutions trying to do research in the same communities. And how do you sort of get through the noise and break through, knowing all the things that you're competing against in a similar space? And then the last thing is sort of retention and dissemination. Retention is critical. If you're doing clinical trials, people need to go through all phases of it in order to be able to collect the data that you need to demonstrate effectiveness. But also the dissemination piece of once you got the data, how do you give it back in ways that the community could benefit from? We put an awful lot of energy into writing op-eds, into being on local news stations, local radio stations, putting materials into culture-specific newspapers, doing community forums, getting the word out in that way. We don't rely on publications and presentations to make an impact in our communities. Every investigator that does work through our RCMI has to meet with the CRAB at minimum of 2 times. One before the research is started, and one after it's completed to talk about how are you going to disseminate these results back into the community. There's a lot of bidirectional benefit. The community members are able to identify the challenges that need to be addressed, so they know that the work that we are doing or the work that is the work that they want to see happen. They have a lot of influence on the research taking place in the community. Our pilot studies, no matter how good the science is, if the community doesn't like it, we won't fund it. And so you are to engage them first before wasting your time to submit an application. We have to facilitate the rapid dissemination of the research back into the community, and they play a vital role in that, so that we can avoid that 15 to 17-year translational gap. And they also integrate their lived experiences into sort of helping develop novel solutions to what they see happening. There's nothing like someone not knowing what the issues are coming into your home and telling you how to solve it. But you might have a lot of great solutions, but we just don't have the resources to sustain it. How do we build off of those things that we know are working and then add a few little elements to it to make sure it's sustainable? From a scientist standpoint, you now have access to community members that want to engage in your research, whereas in the past, nobody would sign up, show up, or complete. You have the capacity to design stronger research projects, and they actually believe the project is now stronger because people are participating, the data is looking a lot stronger, you're presenting it, there's coverage of it, and the impact is much clearer. I think faculty also learn the limitations of their training in this process. You know, we believe we come from these very prestigious institutions. You know, I could say from The Ohio State University, I was at Harvard Medical School. None of that stuff trains you to deal with reality. You know, none of that stuff trains you. I tell this to all the students that apply to work with me. There's nothing in this program that is going to train you to solve all the issues you see in the communities that you want to impact. That's work that has to happen above and beyond the training because we're just not there yet. And ultimately, if you buy into this, you have the capacity to make a much greater collective impact on the community to where in real time you can see the efforts of your work making folks love life again, helping people see their value again. So I want to be very clear that health disparities are not normal. Everything I showed you in that first slide, those are not normal human conditions. Systemic racism, all these things are not normal human conditions. And what we are seeing is a reaction to being in a not normal environment. We have to invest in prevention. It's so much easier to stop something from happening than it is to treat it across the lifespan. Basic skills around how to manage stress is one way to think about it. But there are also other ways of thinking about it around how do you impact your elected officials to eradicate these environmental issues that are causing problems to begin with. One of the reasons why I didn't go into being a therapist is that I didn't see the value in, and this is a crazy statement, so just bear with me. I didn't see the value talking one-on-one, trying to help someone cope with an environment that's driving them insane. For me, that seems like the wrong place to put that energy. We need to be changing the environment so that people can naturally be themselves. And so that's what drove me to want to go into this side of that continuum. We have to acknowledge, mitigate, and eradicate the social determinants of health. This is something that takes everyone to be on board to do. We have to get the outcomes back into the community. And ultimately, we have to understand that this stuff affects everybody. If people are uninsured, everybody is paying for it anyway, one way or the other. And so we have to figure out strategies to both prevent these things from happening, strategies for generating new knowledge in this space that's actually valid knowledge, and strategies for disseminating this stuff so that folks could actually benefit from all this investment of time and energy that we see taking place. And with that, I thank you.
This is phenomenal. So we have a few minutes for questions. So we are open for questions. All right, I will take a question. Go ahead, please.
Dr. Bassi, first of all, thank you.
Louder.
Hi, Dr. Bassi. First of all, thank you so much. Dr. Harris, Human Men, Child Development here at SUNY Downstate. I really appreciated your comments about the need to operationalize community, but I was hoping you could expand on it. And just a couple of points I'd like to ask you about. Coming to Brooklyn from outside, I was struck, certainly we're a very diverse community here, but it's also to me one of the most, most balkanized, separate, fragmented communities I've seen. So one is, how do you talk about community with a capital C when it is so heterogeneous? Two, whether it's your area of addiction, I'm in the area of neurodevelopmental disorders, within those, to some extent, those are the communities I assume we should be reaching out to, but yet within those, there's also a lot of very mixed approaches, backgrounds. There's a lot of debate in my area of high functioning, low functioning. We're moving away from that term. And very different ideas of what should happen and how things should be called and how research should be conducted. And then the question of, as you work with or trying to reach members of community who are most at risk, often they may be those who least have voice. And I'm wondering, how do you have the right people represented in your community boards and participatory research? Thank you.
Good questions. I'll try to remember all of them, so I might go in reverse order. So when I mentioned our CRAB, because we focus on addictions and cancer prevention, all the members of our CRAB are either folks in recovery, cancer survivors, or folks who are activists in the community or patient navigators. And so they are all people who have firsthand experience with a lot of the variables that we're interested in sort of pursuing. So that's how we sort of make sure the right people are in those conversations. As it relates to how we define communities, Houston has a unique setup where they have these super neighborhoods. Maybe it's sort of like boroughs here, but much smaller, cleaner catchment areas. Within those spaces, I think we have to think about culture and think about it in a way that is sort of the deep structure of culture. Because I think oftentimes we are convinced that there's more within group variation than there are between group variation. But it really depends on what are we talking about when we say culture. If we say something like believe in some higher power, I think we can get consensus. But if we talk about what is the name of that person or entity, maybe there's some individual differences. And so we have to figure out what are the big C elements that are driving the behaviors that we want to affect, because in that space, there's a lot of commonality. Then a third factor is sort of the intersectionality of a lot of different identities. You know, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's race and ethnicity, you know, there's just so many different ways in which people identify, all of which contribute to these stress loads that I'm describing. And so I think being able to appreciate who it is that you're working with, understanding SES is a factor, understanding identity is a factor, but also recognizing that many of these folks, regardless of these individual differences, have shared lineages. And if we tap into some of that deeper structure stuff, we have much more commonalities that we can build off of. But you can't do it with assumptions.
Any other questions? Yes, we have one of our scholars who wants to ask a question. State your name clearly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bassi. That was a wonderful presentation. Given that trust, oh, sorry, my name is Dr. Adeboye Jumbo. I happen to be one of the transport scholars. And so going back to my questions, given that mistrust is one of your title headline, and using the CRAB, how were you able to gain the trust of the community? Because usually that is always a problem, even with their physicians or clinicians. Trust is a major issue in vast and many communities.
So I think for me, I take the approach that your mistrust is with the University of Houston, not with me. So I start with that. None of our logos have the University of Houston on it, which took a fight all the way to the president of the university from a branding standpoint, because we recognize that there's a historical thing that existed before we even arrived onto the campus. Second piece, I'm pretty transparent about my own experiences. I grew out of extreme poverty. I've lived in the spaces that they're navigating now. And I think when they can connect with somebody that truly understands their experiences, they're a little bit more open to have that conversation versus that person they feel had the silver spoon their whole life and sort of have an academic approach to their sort of lived experiences. And so it takes one-on-one engagements. It takes me being there, not just sending another person there on my behalf. It takes continued engagement. It's not easy work, which is why I also don't think it's feasible to not have an infrastructure and hope that you can just go in and do this work in a matter of 1 or 2 years. These are 10, 15 years of investing that energy.
I have one more question. The other question that I have is, you mentioned that if the community do not like the project, they wouldn't involve in it. How do you then get them involved even before getting the grant?
So when they apply for our pilot grant program, one of the documents is who are your community collaborators? How will this work affect or have a positive impact on the community? And if you can't answer these questions, then you need to meet with the CRAB before you actually submit an application. And so in that engagement, they get firsthand engagement with the CRAB at that moment in time. And so they could either accept the feedback, modify their work to be responsive, or not. And just like if you're submitting your revised application to NIH, when you're not responsive to the reviewer's critiques, it's not going to get funded. And so we put a lot of value into what our CRAB says. And then we have another layer, which is our community advisory board. And so these are a lot of the movers and shakers in health spaces, whether it's elected officials, people who run some of the FQHCs and so forth. They provide another independent review. And so we have two different community settings that are looking at this work to see, one, is this responsive to the issues that we said we want to see happen? And two, have the methods been revised enough so that we would want to participate if we like the project?
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Okay. Dr. Foster.
Thank you very much, Dr. Obasi, for your presentation. I have a question about interpretation of data. So we all recognize that race is not genetically based and it's a social construct. So some of the data that you presented, looking at the difference between, I think, people of African ancestry and European ancestry, how do we then disseminate that information in a way that one doesn't come away with the notion or the misunderstanding that these are race-based differences, rather they're an impact of structural racism and going through like generations and epigenetics and other things that are not gene-based. So how do we change the narrative so that as health disparities researchers, we don't leave the community with the understanding that these are race-based differences rather than these are differences based on racism?
Gotcha. Good question. So I think oftentimes when we think about genetic markers, sometimes we feel like they're immutable, meaning you can't change them, right? And so we know that that's not necessarily the case. We know that race is a social construct, but we also know that certain alleles are more prevalent in certain subcommunities than they are in another. And so for us, we think about it from an interactive standpoint. What was I biologically given at birth? And how did my environment shape its expression across time? Because you can go into the same neighborhoods, have people with the same biological makeup, but have totally different trajectories based on the difference in how the different ways in which the environment impacts them and ways in which they navigate the environment. And so oftentimes I feel that the environment is way more critical than the initial biological makeup. And that happens in mental health as well. You can have the vulnerabilities, but if you're in a healthy space, you won't necessarily have the things that come out of that. And so the environment is a key factor. I think understanding culture is a key factor because I think various cultures also have healthy ways of addressing challenges. Sometimes we might want to laugh at it, but there's something of value in some of those interventions. And so I think also empowering that while the environment is a factor, we also have things that have been passed down from generation to generation that also work as effectively as some of these other things. And so I do think that it's important to take an empowering approach to this, which is why our CRAB has to see these documents before they're disseminated, because we don't want anything that's going to be disseminated that actually harms the community or paints them as, you're going to have this no matter what. And so the work that I do was designed to demonstrate how social experiences, how the environment gets under the skin and has a negative impact on our health trajectories, versus just saying African Americans are going to be born to be addicted to alcohol or they're going to be born to have prostate cancer. There are things that shape these things to be more likelihood regardless of what our genetic makeup is.
Since I'm moderating this session, I'll ask a question. Anyway, my question has to do with the CRAP, right? We have the Community Research Advisory Board, and then we're engaging them in the training, and everything is fine. But if you look at the way the money is flowing, it doesn't really flow into the community. It flows to the university first, then it goes to the community. So my question to you is, why can't the NIH and other funders let the funds flow the opposite? Flow into the community first, then flow into the university. Why is that not happening?
Well, I can't speak for NIH. But I can tell you this question was raised 2 weeks ago. We had a conference with NIMHD. And their position is that they are actually starting to put out mechanisms that are funding community members to do this work in partnership with the university. So trying to reverse that sort of strategy. But I think the other piece, though, is while that is helpful, there also needs to be a loosening of the regulatory aspect of things so that we can give the money directly to the community members when it's beneficial. Because for me, I have no, $12 million, it's not my money. I need the money to go to the places that can make the biggest impact. But sometimes if I want to give it to this group, university says, oh, you can't do that, you got to have subcontracts, it doesn't go through this route, all those kind of barriers. And so I do think that there are regulatory barriers that make it more difficult for us to do this work effectively. But I also like the idea of them funding community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, and other entities directly to cut us out of that decision-making.
Well, we can integrate, but the funds can flow in that direction. Anyway, we have one question from the chat.
This question comes from Thelma Carrillo. They ask, how do you stay motivated in continuing to work in the university, which you have to battle even on the use of logos on flyers? If even sometimes as simple as a logo is an issue, then it seems that the university will definitely not support political actions, with much of CBPR results call for.
Can you say that one more time?
The whole thing.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, so the follow-up was, even if something as simple as a logo is an issue, then it seems that the university will definitely not support political actions, which much of CBPR results call for.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very clear what the university is. And I think if you know what the university is, you're less likely to be upset about how it operates. But I think once you know how it operates, you know who to talk to, you know what is policy and what is preference. And so I always look at what is policy versus what is preference. If it's a preference and there's no policy against it, I need to talk to somebody else in order to move this along. And so I'm very diligent about that. I think when you begin to see the impact that it's having on people's lives, that's where the energy comes from. Because I know real people are benefiting from this work. I think if I was just publishing journal articles and just doing a traditional academic thing, I would probably quit a long time ago. But I think doing that community engaged work and seeing that impact is sort of what gives me the fuel to do it and to fight that fight.
Okay, I think we really appreciate Dr. Bass's view of this subject and the success that you have accomplished over the years and the impact you've had on the community and sharing all that information with us. So on behalf of the Transport PIs, I really want to thank you for this wonderful talk and engagement. Thank you. Okay, so I will now introduce Lakia Maxwell to take over the next session and introduce the moderators.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. At this time, we are going to begin panel 1, and I'm going to introduce the moderator, Dr. Azure Thompson, who is the assistant professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences in the School of Public Health at Downstate. And also Dr. Navika Gengrade, who is our transport scholar and postdoctoral researcher.
Is it on now? Okay. Good morning. Oh my gosh, the presentation was great, and I'm thinking of so many different threads that I would like to go a lot deeper into, and I think we'll have an opportunity to go into those key questions you had, particularly with this panel this morning. So I would like to welcome our panelists for this first panel on what is community engagement. So first, Guillermo Gomez from the Urban Design Forum. And Sarita Duper from Live Light, Live Right.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I know it's early, so let's shake it up a bit and jump into some really exciting conversation. I'm Guillermo Gomez. I'm Director of Programs at the Urban Design Forum. A little bit about myself. I'm not a scientist or a public health expert, but I think of myself as a facilitator, as a connector, as an organizer. So I feel very, very humbled to kind of be in a space with you all today, so thank you for the invitation. So I want to share a little bit about the Urban Design Forum and kind of the institution I work through. So before we jump into a really exciting conversation on what is community, I'm excited to share the work I lead through the Urban Design Forum. And I'm going to run through very quickly through a couple slides so that we provide enough time for conversation. Are we good? Okay, great. Sounds good. So we're a network of civic leaders working in the fields of architecture, urban design, planning, community and real estate development. And as of this past year, we're adding a growing community of health advocates and practitioners and arts and culture and community leaders. Really the core of our work is guided by equity, climate justice, housing accessibility, and really the many challenges that we're facing in the built environment. And we try to make sure we involve all stakeholders and disciplines and folks at the table to define really tactical solutions for big urban issues. So how we work in a very different variety of ways. We build a community of leaders that are caring, maintaining, and building our city, who are constantly learning from each other. We support experiential learning on site visits. We support leadership development and civic engagement opportunities for practitioners across their careers. And this is kind of a fun diagram of what we actually do. We host convenings, lead public realm pilots and demonstrations, support government partnerships, and QA policy research. Just a little bit of what is our community by the numbers. And again, I'm actually really excited to explore what community means with the fellow panelists and the group here today, but these numbers show our community at the forum. I always like to think of ourselves as a community of different communities, and our staff stewards this big, beautiful infrastructure of visionaries at the neighborhood scale as well as the city scale, and we support creating those connections in between. So I want to briefly jump into two distinct initiatives that we're actually actively thinking about them very in connection over the course of the next upcoming year. One that brought me here to Downstate specifically with our work with Dr. Thompson as well as Dr. Marlene in the audience today around a community of interdisciplinary thinkers that we've been organizing around a specific initiative that's called Good Forum. And it's been a year-long advocacy initiative that's convened working groups and public health programs, public programs to deepen dialogues between public health and the design community. So creating those links between those often very siloed disciplines. And over the past year, we've been in really deep dialogues on the role of the built environment and how that plays in both positive and negative health outcomes. So through our public programs, we've been able to engage with voices in the public health field like Dr. Bob Fullilove to discuss homelessness and mass incarceration, as well as neuroscientists at the Zuckerman Institute to discuss intergenerational trauma memorials. So we've been assembling a group and a cohort of 30 fellows working across different fields, architects, landscape architecture, planning, but epidemiologists, trauma therapists, and artists to shape new policy ideas for how we should be designing and planning New York City neighborhoods in order to ensure health prevention. Some of the lenses quickly that we've been thinking through are both physical and mental health, and our fellows have developed a range of ideas that we're going to be launching and advocating for later this summer, but some of the ideas include health improvement districts, leveraging anchor institutions, trauma-informed design guidelines for public spaces, minimum indoor air quality standards, as well as linking mental health services for people experiencing homelessness in parks. Now I want to quickly share some of our community-led design projects that have been that began in 2020. Urban Design Forum led Neighborhoods Now, which was a pandemic response initiative in partnership with the Van Allen Institute. We mobilized over 200 professionals to provide technical assistance to 11 community-based organizations. What began as design support for a safe reopening of small businesses and community groups grew into an initiative and much longer partnerships over numerous years. To share the geographic diversity of this work, just from left to right, we supported Think Chinatown, which is a small arts-based organization, to launch an open-air cultural festival, which ended up serving around 8,500 attendees in one night. In the middle, we also supported Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation with a backyard tourism initiative, as well as guidance on the open restaurants and open streets programs for some local businesses. And then on the far right, we supported Northwest Bronx Community Clergy Coalition with designing and fabricating outdoor dining structures, as well as longer-term visioning around the Kingsbridge Armory. So through these neighborhood partnerships, we've really come to learn on-the-ground knowledge of the multiple challenges and inequities in New York City's planning and design process that are reflected directly by the built environment. These challenges range from top-down approaches that fail to respond to neighborhood needs, or a lack of true inclusivity and ownership in the planning process itself. We also see structural inequalities around poor maintenance in public space with uneven and unequal city funding. Ultimately, communities in historically underinvested neighborhoods know what they want and know what they need, and we want to provide the tools, the resources, and capacity so that neighborhoods can shape and steward their own public spaces. So this is kind of another nice fun diagram that really sums up how we understand and approach our work, with our neighborhood partners always at the center and leading us really along the way through the process. I'll pass the mic to Azure or our next speaker, Dr. Sarita, but I'm excited to explore how others define community and share a little bit of our thinking of why true community-led planning can support community and social cohesion. So I'll pass the mic back to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Pamela Straker, Dr. Straker, Dr. Fable for inviting me, the entire planning committee, and Dr. Basi for such an inspiring and humbling talk. My background quickly is I'm a pediatric cardiologist. I'm associate professor at SUNY Downstate, but I started the model for childhood obesity over 20 years ago. It's an initiative, again, part of university, but away from the university because of all the struggles we go through, and recognized that this was a disease 20 years ago. It was just labeled a disease in 2012, but we in this community, and it was new for me because I studied in India, then I came here, I did my residency and fellowship in Manhattan, Cornell, and I never saw any of these issues, just few streets down or few avenues down, we would not see these issues. And when I came to Brookdale initially and then at Downstate, we were faced with severe obesity very early in the late 90s, before they were talking about obesity. So putting together a coalition, a collaboration with community, we created this model called Live Light, Live Right. And it's a pioneering chronic disease community-based healthcare model which focuses on childhood obesity, prevention, and treatment. So we talk a lot about prevention, but we had already reached that stage where these kids were having diseases related to obesity in their teens, and promoting access to healthy lifestyle choices in an underserved neighborhood. We ultimately ended up creating our own independent organization because of all the political issues related to translating our work into the community. The reason we chose obesity is because we were faced with it right directly. 25% of the children we deal with in the community were obese, and many of them had comorbidities already related to obesity. And it's been defined as a disease only in 2012. Live Light, Live Right was founded in 2003. Obesity medicine defined this as a chronic, relapsing, multifactorial disease. And in short, it affects not only the behavior, but it's maladaptive for their metabolism, health, physical health, and mental health. And as Dr. Abbasi said, we strongly believe that although there is a genetic predisposition to this disease, it's your habits and environment, built-in environment, and your socioeconomic status which really produces the disease. So this whole model is very important to understand, and that's what we do in the clinics when we engage our patients to explain to them, yes, you have a genetic predisposition, and the easiest way I explain to them, it's like an asthma. You have the predisposition for asthma, but if you're born in, say, Sweden, and you've lived there in a clean country, and you never really experienced any pollution, you never knew you had asthma. But then you come to New York City and you suddenly develop asthma, and people wonder what happened. You always had the predisposition, but your environment triggered the response. So similarly, in the last 40 years, we've seen this rapid rise in obesity because of the change in the environment, and certain communities like ours in this neighborhood certainly affected more. And altogether, this obesity model leads to psychosocial issues and the cardiovascular complications, diabetes, etc. So the Live Light, Live Right program had to be multifaceted. We had to get out of the academic centers. We had to actually go into the community. So our team consists of compassionate experts from obesity medicine specialists to primary care physicians to nurse practitioners to community care coordinators, nutritionists, chefs, exercise trainers, and the community partners. We include medical evaluation and treatment at all levels. We have primary care, secondary care, tertiary care. When I say tertiary care, there is no tertiary care obesity program available in this community where 30% of our kids are suffering. It includes anti-obesity medications if needed. It includes access to surgery if needed. Yes, none of them have access to things like that. Family nutritional behavior counseling, fun and safe weekly supervised exercise programs in the community, individual treatment plans. No one size fits all, each family is different. And seasonal activities within the community during the summer. Some of our partners over the years, and there have been more, have been the Brownsville Recreation Center, where we continue to hold our classes, the YMCAs, CAMBA, Bike New York, Health First, who's helped us with training the physicians, local chefs in the community, City Harvest, East New York Farms, and of course, to help us with the evaluation and implementation, SUNY Downstate School of Public Health has been instrumental in helping us doing the evaluation for the program. This is showing you some of our kids working out at the BRC with our trainer, who's actually been with us for over 20 years. So you see the committed staff also has been with us for 20 years. This is the collaboration with Bike New York. So over the summers, the kids would join the program. Just shows you how we involve and engage the community and the kids. East New York Farms, they have to learn what it is to eat healthy, how the food grows, exposing them to things like that. And we could do this work with this help of 2 seed grants. One was from the New York State Department of Health, and the other was from the Robin Hood Foundation. We also then went on to get the 2 awards from the Healthcare Trustees of New York State and the Healthcare Association of New York State, which actually gave us some incentives to go further in this. It was recognized that the community needed such models. A community engaged research works on with SUNY Downstate, where we define our target groups, which is childhood obesity, dealing with kids 5 to 19, building our relationships, finding funding resources, skills training for both the staff and the community workers, and the parents, of course, creating and implementing the model, maintaining a database, and then program evaluation. Now, maintaining the database has been instrumental because for the last 20 years, we have data on every patient collected, seen in our program, and we've been able to do what we call a real-world evaluation with the help of Dr. Afable's group, where we used a transcreation implementation science perspective, evaluating real-world interventions that leverage community assets as opposed to testing evidence-based approaches in experimental conditions. So this method, basically we used a survival analysis because we were concerned that patients would drop in and drop out. There was a lot of attrition in this area. So we used a survival analysis to inform us on everybody, including the dropouts. And outcome was recorded as an event or censored if the participant drops out. This allowed for variations in entry time and point into study. So there are not too many long-term studies in obesity. You would get 6 months or 12 months follow-up. So this way we could track our patients for 5 years. We stratified by contact hours because the evidence has shown that the more contact you have with the patient, the more benefits they will get. We stratified into low versus high contact hours for 50 hours. And we saw there was a significant difference with the time it took for the patients to reach their BMI metrics in the high contact hours compared to low contact hours. And when they did a hazard ratio from going to low to high contact hours, the hazard actually improved like 6 times. It was 6 times faster to reduce your metrics. So again, it's so important to understand how to engage these patients long term and not to let them drop out, because it's the contact over a period of time. We have to be patient, we have to be there for this to work. The other qualitative kind of research we do, we're just going to give you an example and leave more time for the discussion. One of our Dr. PH students from SUNY Downstate, she led this study, and when she looked into, we found it very challenging to keep kids coming into the exercise program and to stay in the exercise program. They don't like to exercise, they don't want to be there, and a lot of it is again to do with the brain chemistry. And it's fascinating to hear Dr. Abbasi speak to that, because I always think their cortisol levels must be really low when they come into the office, because their moods are very low. Their severe obesity, it's like an addiction. Their brains have been modified, and you see that there's no response. Their bodies are like, they're storing fat, and the physiology is completely changed because the chemical nature of the foods they've been eating has changed their physiology, and the physiology is driving their behavior. And that's what they've shown in the functional MRIs, like Dr. Abbasi was showing in obesity, that their brains only light up with very high dopamine levels only when they're seeing these fast, fatty foods. So no matter how much fruits and vegetables or exercise you give them, they don't want that. So sometimes it's not about access, it's about actual utilization. How are we going to get them to utilize these services? So we have free exercise programs, we have free access to fruits and vegetables, but it was still very difficult for them to access it. So she looked at this study, and she looked into insights into challenges and facilitators to physical activity among Brooklyn teens, and what their responses were in brief: fun and support from parents, peers, program staff facilitated achieving their physical activity goals, and barriers were low self-efficacy, inactive families, fear of neighborhood gangs and crime, and perceptions that the parks were small, overcrowded, with limited physical activity options for adolescents. So even our centers, which we had in the community, they're not really safe. The neighborhoods around that is not safe. The kids didn't feel safe coming to our centers. We had to have the centers in the community. They're not going to go out 5 miles from here. So we had challenges. Another quick study we did was to correlate what are parental perceptions. Yes, the parents are involved. Are they ready to make change? And this was published in the Maternal and Child Health Journal, and we saw that despite most of them indicating, yes, we are ready, they reported readiness to make changes on a scale of 8. Approximately 70% that surveyed did not keep more than 4 clinic visits during the 3-year period. They're supposed to keep 4 a year, or attend exercise classes. So you may be ready, you may think you're ready, you want to participate, you want to do it, but some barriers come in the way and you cannot. The positive parental perceptions when they're related to health, body weight, self-image, of their own self-image and their child, that was associated with improved compliance. So our impact so far has been improvement in health outcomes, empowerment and skills development in the community and the families, training of stakeholders, especially local physicians. Physicians are not trained in community programming or medicine or obesity medicine at all, nutrition. None of the medical students are trained, so our program really focuses on that and understanding the barriers of compliance and creating a replicable model. Thank you so much for your attention, and we'll take more time in the questions.
All right. Thank you for sharing information about your respective organizations. So our first question is about what is community, or the way that Dr. Abbasi, the question he proposed was, how is community operationalized? And I would actually like to start with Dr. Duber, because I thought your story about how this organization, how you founded it, how it started, was very interesting. And you described getting out of the academic institution and because of the limitations of it. So what was that getting out? Like, who was the community that you were getting out to? Or basically, what was the community? How did you think about it at that time?
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Going back 20 years or more, doing pediatric cardiology, expecting to treat kids with congenital heart disease, but in this neighborhood, I was getting a lot of referrals for kids with hypertension, dyslipidemia, but it was related to their weight. And I tell this story that 2 kids really changed the way I thought about it, because both of them came to me with this dark coloration on their neck. You know, doctors know it's called acanthosis nigricans, and it's associated with high insulin levels and pre-diabetes. And this was late 90s, and it didn't make sense to me. And both of them had dilated hearts, very big hearts. We call that dilated cardiomyopathy. There was no cause for it. The whole workup was done. It was thought related to their weight. They were referred for transplants to Columbia. Both of them failed the transplants because they were too obese to get cleared by anesthesia, so they both passed away over a period of time. So that really got me thinking at that time. And then more and more patients came in. So I spoke to my colleagues, and they said, this is a problem in the community. What are you going to do? This is everywhere here. Mm-hmm. So I said, okay, well, we have to go out into the community. Mm-hmm. So at that point, we applied to New York State Department of Health. But to put that together, they said, you have to apply for a grant. I said, I don't know how to apply for the grant. I just finished my fellowship. I don't know. So I had to put together the learning of how to apply for a grant. This is not a big academic center, right? We're not in a huge university. I was at Brookdale, SUNY Downstate. I joined later on. I was first at Brookdale when I started this program. So it was not easy to get the grant. And then we had to involve our community members. We had to think we needed nutritionists. We think we need psychologists. And then, little by little, we engaged first the community members, meaning the direct patients, the families. Yeah. We included them, what did they want, mm-hmm. and then had them on our board, and then went out into the communities, parks and recreation, schools, mm-hmm. and housing authorities, mm-hmm. got them on our team, mm-hmm. Then picked our own staff. Mm-hmm. That was very important, having the community care coordinators. So it was all starting from ground zero. I didn't, had to just figure it out.
Well, I think it's a interesting description of the community, because you're thinking about your patients.
Yes.
Who's coming into your clinic as my community, and bringing in people who you work with in your clinic as a part of that community. Yes. So almost like reframing what the clinic is.
Exactly.
As that being a community, and then it sounds like you expanded to think about all the institutions and supports that are in the neighborhood of the community that these patients are coming
You're
from.
Exactly right. Like getting a psychologist and a nutritionist in our clinic, sitting there in the clinic. Mm-hmm. It was like revolutionary. I mean, nobody had that. So I had to diversify and move away and create an independent organization, because we would not get so much time by the institution to take care of these patients, which took hours sometimes.
So do you still think of the community that you serve in that way, as your clinic, and then the resources and supports that are in the neighborhood? Or so when I teach about community engaged research, the academic description, you think about a community of geography, so where people live, or identity or affinity. And so this very much sounds like a community of geography. So.
Exactly.
Thank you. Okay, Guillermo, you described community of different communities. So.
Yes.
So, yes. And I know you did not found this organization, but you came to the organization. So, how do you think about, or I don't know, how does the organization, how does the Urban Design Forum think about what is community?
It's interesting, and this is more of a kind of a recent framing that I've been thinking about the forum as a community of communities. And maybe that's just from my perspective, who thinks a lot in systems. I think historically we're a little over a 40-year organization. We generally we're founded by journalists and planners really interested in being civically engaged, or at least having kind of a shared interest in the future of the city. But it was in some sense a little bit insular, and I think that has transformed over the years, especially over the past decade. And I think more so, especially during the pandemic. I think there was a real transition in 2020, and a lot of organizations and institutions across the globe were coming with a reckoning of like, who are we serving? And I think we were asking ourselves that question too. With this community design work, I think what, as I mentioned, is it started as a bit of a kind of a scrappy, let's put a couple of designers and thinkers that want to invest in and support community. How do we leverage that network between two institutions, ourselves and the Van Allen Institute of designers? And I think, interestingly, that became actually a long-term partnership, and we were asking ourselves those questions. So who are we serving? And I think we constantly do, but I think we're expanding that network and community of only planners and designers to one that actually is having deep conversations and partnerships with community-based organizations and those that they serve too. So I think of it from this like a multi-tiered, not necessarily hierarchical, but those that are thinking at the city scale, but also at the geographic scale too.
I think, Dr. Duber, as far as, when you think about community engaged research, you think about an affected community and then who might be the representatives of those communities. So when you think about your work, what is the impact, and do you think about that affected community within urban design?
Yeah, I mean, we ask ourselves this question. We're a small staff of 8. What's the long-term impact that we want to have? And I think at the short term, we are providing resources and tools for community-based organizations to see their visions come to life, whether in a short term or a long term within that neighborhood, specifically in the public realm. But we're also asking ourselves, where do we want to see the profession of design and planning go as well? That I imagine all of you in this room are thinking about, especially in the public health field. So these are multiple questions and both multiple transformations that we'd like to see. Yeah.
Well, a follow-up this is for both of you, but I'll start with Guillermo because Dr. Camacho Rivera and I, we are a part of this good forum. And the good forum was, we were working with public health practitioners like ourselves, urban designers, architects, who else? Policymakers. And we were brought together to come up with specific policy recommendations. And coming into that space, we all had different backgrounds, trainings, perspectives, and something I'm particularly interested in is ideology or beliefs about what is the problem and how to solve that. So when you think about that, particularly with communities of different communities, and if there are different beliefs about what the problem is and how to solve it, how do you approach that and think about that? And similar for you.
It's such a great question, and one that I think we were even posing ourselves. What is going to happen when we put epidemiologists in the room that necessarily haven't worked directly with architects and vice versa? How are they going to come to somewhat of a shared language? And I think as we were designing the program and this initiative, we wanted to ensure that there was significant time in order to develop a shared language. And I think this is also a question that I pose to you all kind of working in the public health field. How are you kind of disseminating that information? I know it was a little bit earlier in the keynote presentation. How are you sharing that information? How are you translating that in a language that it is accessible? And I think that the time aspect is super important.
You're talking about spending time together.
Yes.
Okay.
I think in order to come to somewhat of a shared language, you need that time.
I agree. That was certainly the experience within the good forum. So, Dr. Duber, similar. If the problem is obesity and your community, like you are a trained physician and you have a perspective on, the causes and solutions to that. Was that like shared among the community or the community that you served and how they understood what the problem was and how to solve the problem?
Absolutely. I think that was the whole starting point. Obesity was never treated as didn't ever get the respect which other diseases got. It was more heroic to be a cardiologist than to be an obesity expert. So whenever I'm at a party or something, I don't even say I'm an obesity expert because everybody wants you to be a cardiologist, and it's okay. It's too. So there was a perspective that it's not a disease where doctors need to treat. It's a disease where it's their own fault. It's they make their own choices. And to get rid of that stigma, it took us a long time. We still not got rid of it, but we created a lot of awareness in the community, first with every patient, using the 4 words that it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's a combination of genetics. It's a combination of environment. Going out into the community, going to the community forums, health fairs, schools, participating with the community boards, PTA meetings, explaining to them how healthy foods work, how unhealthy foods work. Dr. Lambert talked about the unhealthy foods here, right, in the community, but there is a need for it because people are going for it, so that's why there are more fast food restaurants. These kids are nurtured on these kinds of foods. They're brought up on these kinds of food. They don't know what carrots look like. They don't know what beets look like. Tamar, one of our partners, they give them bags of fruit. They looked at that bag and said, we don't know what to do with it. So they're nurtured on this kinds of fast food. So it's hard to change the perspective, but slowly, one patient at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time, patients become our own ambassadors for the program. Once they change themselves, they go out into the community and spread the word, and that's how we've been changing.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question, and this leads to the second question for this panel, and that is your approach to community engagement. And I think you've described a lot of ways in which you brought in, or in which you've engaged community and built community. Can you be more, say more about that? Like, I'm thinking about trust, like building trust. Did it help that these were already people or children that you were seeing as your patients? Or can you talk more about that process, like believing in what you do in your organization and getting involved?
So I think from that perspective, my 2 parts of my career diverged. I treat cardiology patients separately. They're different. They've got congenital heart disease. Very few of them have the obesity problem. And the kids with increasing weight gain are treated through the Live Light, Live Right program. So I'm Dr. Duper for the pediatric cardiology patients and the Live Light, Live Right program for the... So we had to give it a name because nobody would like to be called the obesity program. It's a stigma associated with that. So that was the first thing. And then we really engage the patients to understand what they're going through. We have questionnaires which are asking them what they eat. So we only start the conversation after they fill up that questionnaire. And some kids will fill up, they eat fast food 5 days a week. Some people are drinking juice 8 cups a day. So that starts the conversation. So we have questionnaires. We do a psychological assessment on all kids because many of them have been bullied for their weight for many years. So they don't even want to talk about it in the clinic. So, you have to know that each patient is coming with their own defeated backgrounds. They've come in defeated into the clinic. They don't want to be there. So it takes a lot for us to engage them first. So that starts the engagement process, engaging the families, and then having them do those contact in time with our nutritionist, with our care coordinator, with, slowly getting into a healthy lifestyle. And then keeping them going for 4 or 5 years. We have some patients who've been in our program for 10 years. And then it's a chronic disease. It's not going to go away in 6 months. So that's the other aspect of it. And then Dr. Fable's group helping us put this all together and actually understanding, yes, this actually had an impact. So that's part of the engagement.
Mm-hmm. What I'm hearing is these long-term long-term relationships. And so, yes, thank you. And 5 minutes for Well, let me ask Guillermo, make sure I get this in about how you, what does community engagement look like for UDF?
Yeah, I mean, I think that diagram that I had at the very end of centering the community partners first in the process, I think we're thinking about the community engagement model that we're working through and ourselves kind of placed in that process as facilitators that I said at the very beginning. I think we're just supporting and enacting their vision at the end of the day. It's challenging too. I also mentioned like what we envision is that a design and planning profession that's focused on moving away kind of from a client-based approach to one that's focused on social practice and also learning from the communities that they work in and they're not designing for. So that's thinking about that from the professional scale. I think we're also thinking about how can we provide them with long-term resources, and this is a structural and policy kind of change and vision. How do we make sure that that knowledge is held from at the community base and not necessarily always kind of intervention focused? And I not as intervention kind of from the public health standpoint, but one that's top down in scale. So how do we make sure that we create those kind of community organizations and visions that can be led from the grassroots up. So I think that's how we're always kind of envisioning this process.
Thank you. So we do have a discussion, but I do want to take one question. We have, if any questions? Okay, wait, over there.
Thank you for the discussion, and first I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to the conference. This is a very pleasurable experience, especially as a student in the School of Public Health. So my question revolves around the relationship between academia and actually interacting with the community, right? And I'd like to think of this more as a Venn diagram where there's the academic field, there's actually putting it into practice, and my question revolves around the intersection. So how would we, especially since I'm interacting with patients in the Live Light, Live Right program, how would we translate the academic studies behind this research and convey it to the actual patients themselves? And not only that, but in a way that, especially with sensitive topics such as obesity, how would we not only translate it, but do it in such a way where we don't, offend the community that we're speaking to?
Thank you, Jacob. You've been in the clinic and you know what, it's very hard. First of all, I think there need to be more training for primary care physicians to be doing this. We cannot do this alone. We know the art of doing it. We've mastered the art, but it took us 20 years to do that, to learn how to talk to patients. It's very rare that we'll turn a patient away who gets distressed with the information. They listen to the information. We listen to them. First, listening to them helps us create a rapport. We have to be experts at what we do. We had to become obesity medicine experts. We just don't read what comes out in a newspaper and tell someone that that's science. We have to know our science. We have to be able to understand what's going on and be up to date with the science, and then translate that into simple communication strategies to the patients. For now, anti-obesity medications, like I think it's very useful, and it's very bright on the horizon because I've tried that in the last 2 years. As I said, the chemicals are changing the way the physiology is, and that's changing the appetite, and that's perpetuating the obesity. So I had a kid who was autistic just last week, and she was over 350 pounds for the entire life, and she's gone to so many physicians, and she just can't even move. So together with the endocrinologist and genetics, we tested her for genetics. She has some abnormal genes. Together we used all our evidence-based medicines, and she's now on 4 medications to reduce her obesity, and she's down about 25 pounds already. The mother said her appetite is totally changed. So it took evidence-based, lifestyle changes, genetics, interventions, to be able to translate, like you said, the academia into practice. And you're seeing that one patient at a time.
And to pick up on that, I can't speak on the data, communicating data to community members, but I think even in the design profession, as I mentioned, a lot of designers are taught in universities to speak to a client and not necessarily to a community member. So I think there's a lot of unlearning that we're noticing, that spaces like this in this context that are speaking with practitioners in the public health field, and we're starting to see that conversation as well in the design field, but there's a lot of learning to be done.
Right, exactly.
Thank you. And now we will close this panel with our discussant.
Yes, what a great conversation and Q&A. And my role here is just to quickly summarize and give like food for thought. So what this conversation really made me think, and for myself as a public health nutrition researcher and registered dietitian, it made me actually think of expanding the definition of not just community, but also engagement and also research. So like Dr. Obasi said, with community, it's not just at the organizational or the community level, but those with the shared mission, so different stakeholders are all part of the same community, as well as engagement. So it's not just getting in, interacting, but also the breadth and maybe the depth of that. And lastly, in terms of research, can we expand our definition of research? So, sorry, the allergies are getting me. But can we bring some humanity to research so it's not just, we can get the epidemiologists and the architects, like Guillermo was saying, to interact and speak the same language. So just food for thought, expanding our definitions, expanding the worldview here. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank panel number one. You all did a great job, and we're cutting your time, so I know I'm in trouble later on. We're going to take a 10-minute break. Yes, it was supposed to be 15, but it's going to be 10. And things we'll catch up with the time as we go on. So take a break, get some refreshments, and we'll be back.